Faith-Based Mediation Around the World with Ken Sande of RW360.org. That is our topic for today. Welcome to the Lawyers and Mediators International Show and Podcast, where we discuss law and conflict resolution topics to educate both professionals and everyday people. Catch regular episodes on YouTube and anywhere you get your podcasts. Just remember, nothing in these episodes constitutes legal advice, so be sure to talk to a lawyer, as cases are fact-dependent. Hi, everyone. Mac Pierre-Louis here, attorney, mediator, and arbitrator, working throughout Florida and Texas.
And I'm Sheryl Jackson-Matthews, mediator, arbitrator in Texas.
Yes, and with us again, we have Ken Sande of RW360.org, and Ken is the author of the book, The Peacemaker. And this is the book we're going to delve into today a little bit, and as well as talk about Ken's project or business called our Relational Wisdom 360, RW360.org. We have done other episodes with him where we discussed a lot of the topics that he teaches in his trainings through RW360. But now we're going to focus a little bit more on the book and allow him the opportunity to talk about some of the topics on more of a global scale. And so, Ken, welcome back. And just as before, can you say a little bit about yourself to people who might be new to this series?
Yes, I've had the privilege of 40 years of being a peacemaker and mediator and trainer, working across culture around the world. And what I've seen is there's nothing new under the sun. No matter where you are, people can love and get along and have families and productive lives, or they can be at odds with each other. And a lot of it depends on what have we learned about how we deal with relationships, how we deal with conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And this series, not just this series with you, but the entire channel, for the last few years has been devoted to one singular topic, and that is the issue of conflict. Not just conflict in the law, but conflict when we deal with it at the mediation table as well. And so we're always trying to resolve conflict. And sometimes it has to be a judge, somebody who's an ultimate authority who decides what's going to happen. But a lot of times, conflict can be resolved through people dialoguing, sitting down at the table, negotiating, reaching compromise, and working out things that are mutually beneficial for them and their families. And so you've done a lot about conflict in this book, The Peacemaker. And I'll say about it, this comes from the book, or about the book. For more than 25 years, The Peacemaker has helped individuals from all walks of life resolve personal conflicts by applying timeless biblical truths. Ken Sande's practical and proven methods are designed to bring about more than simply a ceasefire. They will lead you toward a true life-changing reconciliation with family members, coworkers, and fellow believers. And Ken, as with your other work, the materials that you write do not just apply to Christians or people who might be fellow believers, but to anybody, people in a secular world, people who might not believe, because we all, as humans, have conflict in our lives, and we all need to learn how to be self-aware, how to address conflicts, how to resolve them, and how to work and better our relationships, especially when they end up affecting our loved ones like our kids. So in this episode, with Sheryl here, we're going to talk to you and have you educate us and the general audience. How do we take some of the truths in this book, Peacemaker, and apply it to some of the conflicts that are going on globally? We call this topic faith-based mediation around the world. And so I guess, could you start off by giving us a little bit of the points that are in your book, and then we can move towards elevating those points from the personal to the more global.
Sure. Well, the Peacemaker book is organized into four major sections, major principles. The first one is to glorify God, or in a secular sense, go higher. What are your highest values? Are you living up to your highest values? And sadly, in the middle of conflict, people often go to their lowest values: revenge, bitterness, anger, blame shifting, all those things. So the first step you've got to decide is, what values do I want to drive me forward in this conflict? So for a Christian, it would be to honor God, to please and honor God. For a non-Christian, be at least live up. Do I value honesty, service, love, kindness, whatever? Second principle is get the log out of your own eye. Take responsibility for your contribution to the conflict before you try to get the other person to see his contribution. And that leads to what we call the golden result. If I blame the other person, he'll probably blame me. If I take responsibility for my role, typically the other person will say, well, now hold on a minute, you're not the only one. Here's what I did. I've seen that again and again. So glorify God or go higher, get the log out of your own eye. Third one is gently restore. How can I graciously and in a winsome and non-threatening way help the other person see her contribution to the conflict? So gentle, thoughtful, non-attacking correction. And then the fourth one is go and be reconciled. How do we negotiate the substantive issues in a way that we both can walk away and say that was fair and that was just? But more importantly, how do we restore our personal relationship through forgiveness and reconciliation? So those are the four basic principles. And we see those applied. The Peacemaker has been translated into 20 languages. So it's being used globally on every continent in the world, except I don't think on Antarctic. I don't believe it's been down there yet. But just let me give you just a few examples. My wife wrote a children's curriculum called The Young Peacemaker that's based on the basic principles of the Peacemaker. Her book has been translated into Spanish, among other things. It's being used all over Latin America, especially in prison systems, including the high security prison in Medellin, Colombia, with former drug lords and terrorists who are finding a whole different way to approach life. Instead of blowing up and killing people, to be reconciled to people, to love people, to serve people. Every year we get a picture of about 20 of these people whose lives have been utterly transformed by a children's curriculum on peacemaking. So that's Latin America. The Peacemaker, the concepts were also used in northern Uganda, still to this day, RB, but back in the mid 90s, I went over there to see for myself some stories I heard. The Karamojong tribe in northern Uganda, it's a cattle-based society, and their worldview is that all the cattle in the world belong to them. So they don't do cattle stealing, they do cattle collecting. When they come and take your cattle, they're collecting cattle they think belong to them. Well, it was a rather benign custom for a long time. The warriors went back and forth, and they'd have these little contests, get some cattle, go back, and then they could get wives because they had the cattle. But then Idi Amin was driven out of power. All of his armories were left unguarded, and now 14-year-old boys had AK-47s. And over 100,000 people were killed in northern Uganda during cattle raids because the cultural tradition of fairly benign cattle back and forth became bloody massacres. And the United Nations went in, the European Union went in, tried to bring peace, no progress. A Christian missionary veterinarian named Val Sheehan went in there, spent 10 years developing a relationship with all these sub-tribes of the Karamojong. She eventually brought some people from a church in Portland that supported her, who'd been trained in peacemaking principles. And they came in and they did training there with the pastors of the tribes, with the elders, the women, the warriors. Each of these groups had special training, and each of these groups began to see how they were contributing to the bloodshed. Because frankly, a lot of people being killed were 8-year-old boys in the field guarding cattle. Children were being massacred. And the pastors began to realize that they had been cowards. They had not stood up and preached against this. It's clearly a wrong thing to do, and they were afraid of the warriors. The chiefs stood up and realized they had been cowardly as well, and they were not guarding their people. They were not leading them on paths of peace. They repented. The warriors began to realize they're just out for themselves, ego, pride, bloodshed, etc. Even the women in the tribes began to repent and realize they felt good when someone went out and stole a bunch of cattle so they could come and marry you, but they started to realize, yeah, there's dead bodies laying in a field to just satisfy me, make me think I have value. So
Hmm.
all these people began to repent of the way they were contributing to this bloodshed. And Val eventually brought some of these sub tribes together. The first one, they were expecting 200 people to come. 2,400 people came to this place called the Nabwal, this valley, this rich valley had been abandoned because of all the violence. And they had a 3-day celebration of repentance and forgiveness. And they agreed that they would start resettling the valley and there'd be no weapons allowed in the valley. And they established 60 peace villages that are still going strong today in northern Uganda, applying the very simple principles: glorify God, get the log out of your own eye, gently restore, go and be reconciled. Those 4 basic principles of peacemaking. So it worked in that country thanks to Val Sheehan, very courageous woman who built relationships and brought that process in. I've been to the Middle East as well, Mac, and I've been in Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt. I've talked to Israelis, Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, and it's heartbreaking to see all the suffering that's going on there. No one is completely innocent. No one is all wrong. Everybody bears some, share of responsibility. And the thing I'm encouraged about is that there's many groups of people that are sincerely seeking ways to make peace, to understand the interests of the other people. A lot of it goes to property rights. Who owns the land? Who has a right to have this farm or this orchard and everything else? So there's a huge amount of that going on. History of violence between a lot of the people there. And yet the people living out these basic principles are finding on a individual, local level, finding ways to make peace. And that encourages me. There's still some mega issues going on. And what's sad there is, and I'm not an expert on geopolitical issues, but I think the problem we see in many countries is people get into power and they will do anything to hold on to power. And that's as true in the United States as it is in the Middle East, as it is in Africa, as it is in India. And it's time immemorial. You read the Old Testament in the Bible. People got a hold of power and they were going to keep power even if it hurt the people they're supposed to be leading and caring for. And I see a lot of that going on too. So that's where I pray that the individual people who really do want to look out for others, treat others as they want to be treated, respectfully, with love and courtesy, that those people would have a louder and louder voice there.
Got it. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think there's a lot you've said right there. When it comes to faith-based approaches, could you give us some examples? Because we don't mean for when we say faith-based mediation that it strictly means a Christian perspective, correct? It
Yeah.
can be applied to different faith traditions. Can you elaborate a little bit about what faith-based mediation is and how conflict resolution from the faith traditions is practiced around the world from different
Yeah.
perspectives?
Any society that endures has had to find effective ways to deal with conflict. And this could be a tribal village in Pakistan or people getting along in New York City. And so all people groups have to find ways to deal with conflict. Sometimes it's very heavy handed. You just squash opposition, you wipe out, adverse voices, but that doesn't usually do well in the long run.
Yeah.
And so, for example, all of the theistic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, have well-established conflict resolution systems. In the Muslim community, when people have business disputes with each other or domestic family disputes, there's an established process for the imam to get involved as the mediator. They're the respected spiritual leaders of the community. They're respected as having wisdom and good judgment and not being biased. Although I mean they're human, you'll see good ones and bad ones just as you will in an American court. But very often they will get involved. In the Jewish community, for example, in New York City, there's a concept called the Beth Din, and that is the Jewish rabbinical courts. And they decide all sorts of disputes within the Jewish community, typically business disputes, family, inheritance, all sorts of things. And some of the best civil law on faith-based arbitration has come out of the Beth Din, that they had faith-based decisions. Someone opposed it in a federal or state court, and federal and state courts have shown great deference to faith-based arbitration. And basically, under the theory of contract, if two people make a contract and agree, they're going to have their dispute resolved according to these faith-based principles. Typically, secular judges will say, "You agree to it, and I'm going to enforce it," and that's it. And then in the Christian community where I work, it's the concept we call Christian conciliation, is basically mediation and arbitration based on biblical values of justice, fairness, truth, treating others as you want to be treated, keeping your word, letting your yes be yes. The Bible is a book, much more, but it certainly is a book of moral and just principles that we encourage and challenge people to live out. Now, around the world, you'll see the same thing. In all sorts of cultures, there are faith-based avenues to resolve conflict. One of the most amazing ones to me is in South Africa, when apartheid came down and Nelson Mandela, who had spent 24 years as a state prisoner on Robben Island. And I spent some time with Nelson Mandela's chaplain, who knew him very well and told me a lot about all that he went through as a political prisoner, the refining, and basically realizing that when he got out and the African National Congress came into power, and many people wanted to now use that power for revenge, Nelson Mandela, who I think is one of the most unique people in the history of the world, said, no, we're not going to just keep this revenge cycle going. And he brought that nation together through a process called the Truth and Reconciliation process, working very closely with Bishop Desmond Tutu, who was bringing a Christian worldview into that process, basically of confession, forgiveness, to break the cycle of injustice and violence. And it's a remarkable thing. Just to add a little levity to it for just a moment,
Sure.
There was a situation where Desmond Tutu was doing a retreat at a monastery in South Africa, and President Mandela wanted to get in touch with him, so he had an assistant call to say, the president needs to talk to Bishop Tutu, and the person at the monastery said, well, he's actually in a silent time, a prayer and meditation right now. And the president's first said, well, you don't understand who's calling. This is the president who's calling to him. And the person's response was, you don't understand who Bishop Tutu's talking to. It's God. Which I thought was a marvelous response to that question. But they worked together and they broke the cycle of violence. It's something to be learned there. I would love to see that attitude permeate other parts of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what else?
I think the theory of confession, I think that works well with a lot of things, probably most things that we are involved in as humans.
Mm-hmm.
But some people have a problem getting there, and I guess that's our job to some extent as mediators, to hold the calm, as Hesha Abrams would say. And more, one more point about being a mediator, more and more, I am feeling that my position as a mediator and an arbitrator is really kind of changing, at least from my perspective. I think that more and more people are really looking for calm They're looking for peace.
Hmm.
That they just want to go, with their families and, have the kids grow up and,
Hmm.
live in a home and what have you. But
Hmm.
there's so many things that stop them from doing that.
Hmm.
And the divorce, when we mediate or when I mediate a divorce, that is part and parcel of the conflict of the relationship
Hmm.
that's caused by who knows what.
Hmm.
So I think as a mediator, I am beginning really to understand. You look at behavior and you kind of, nah, um, especially I do a lot of Zoom mediations.
Hmm.
And so we have to observe the behavior.
Yeah.
Um, but there is that little thing called forgiveness
Yeah.
that we all strive for um, in mediation.
Yeah. Cheryl, do you think that the things that like forgiveness and confession that we do at the personal level,
Mhm.
at the mediation table, can be applied to something more global? Could you speak to that, like taking what Cheryl was discussing, what she's seen, and applying
Mhm.
it to that place? Well, most of us don't work. We're not diplomats. We don't work
Mhm.
at the nation state level. What are your thoughts on that, Ken?
Well, yeah, forgiveness is a key. It's absolutely key because you can't undo the past. What you can do is confess, sometimes make restitution, find a way to bring healing, but ultimately forgiveness. And again, going back to the truth and reconciliation process, what that basically involved was anybody who had committed a crime on either side, the apartheid government, the white Afrikaners, or the black ANC people. There've been murder and all sorts of things on both sides. And the principle was if people who had done those crimes would come forward in a public setting, confess what they had done, and be willing to have the families who've been impacted, maybe someone killed a father, to have the wife and the children be able to engage that person and say, here's how your violent act against my husband has affected my life, to hear what they had done and to publicly confess it and receive sometimes the hurt, the anger, whatever. And they would do that and admit it. They would then be pardoned from the criminal aspects of it. They would not have to suffer, criminal punishment. And it was on both sides. It went both ways. So
Mhm.
confession opened the way to forgiveness.
Mhm.
And another one of my favorite stories, it's in my book, The Peacemaker, on the chapter on forgiveness. Many people have heard of Corrie ten Boom, who had been put into a concentration camp by the Nazis during World War II. And she was her sister died, her father died in the concentration camps. Corrie got out. She was a devout Christian, and believed that God had called her to spend the rest of her life preaching and promoting forgiveness in the name of Christ, even to the people who'd done such terrible wrongs. And one of the compelling stories was she was in Germany teaching at one point, talking about forgiveness. And afterwards, a man walked up to her and she recognized him as one of the guards from Ravensbrück, where her
Mhm.
sister had died.
Mm.
And this man walked up and held out his hand to her and said, "Thank you, Fräulein, to think, as you say, he has washed our sins away."
Mm.
And so here he was holding his hand out to Cora. Now, you talk about amygdala hijacking, where all the pain and things of what had happened. And so her first emotional response was anger and heart toward this man who'd been part of this system that destroyed her family. But as a Christian, she remembered the example of Christ. He laid down his life to forgive the sins of the world. And he tells us, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. And so she knew that she should forgive this man, but she was struggling. And so finally she said, God, I can't forgive him. I need your strength. And at that point, she just felt this power come over her. She reached out and took this man's hand. And she said, a love for this man came over me that nearly knocked me off my feet. And that's what we need. We need that grace of God to forgive even our enemies because he has been so gracious to forgive us. And
Mhm.
that's in each of the religions, in Islam, Judaism, all the world religions, there is a component there that motivates people to forgive, because without forgiveness, societies just tear themselves apart. And so I love Corey's story and how her faith helped her to live that out.
Absolutely.
Just finally wanted to mention that here in Houston, we have the Ismaili Center, and it's primarily culturally for people, Indians.
Mhm.
And what they do is they do not uh, do divorces in public,
Hmm.
nor
Mhm.
do they settle the conflicts with businesses.
Mhm.
They go to a council,
Mhm.
and the council helps them work through the issue. And I worked with someone on a conference last year, and he was one of the people who sat on this three-member board.
Mhm.
And I find it so
Yeah.
interesting that that's how they settle disputes.
Yeah. I think what they probably, I'm not familiar with that particular process, but it's similar to the other ones. And what they recognize is that most conflict is relational.
Right.
You can hire an attorney who can write long briefs and quote statutes and cases, but bottom line, 90% of serious conflict in this world is relational. People have been hurt, they feel they've been personally wronged, and they can spend a lot of money with an attorney trying to make the other person hurt too. But if you can get into a council like that that focuses on the relationship, that's where you find the lasting solutions. And that's true on the personal basis, a divorce case, a business dispute. I think it's true in the Middle East, in Africa and India, and in Washington, D.C.
Awesome. Well, Ken, as usual, thank you so much for your words of wisdom. This topic of faith-based mediations around the world is something that's never going away. Okay, as human beings to have conflict, and human beings need to resolve them. But human beings are also, we're driven to believe in something. And so
Mhm.
we're not just an empty vacuum. We got to fill that hole up with something. And
Right.
so, of course, religion is always going to be at the table. And so we have to then
Mhm.
find ways to address it through our faith traditions.
Yep.
And just, thank you so much for the education that you provided all of us.
You bet.
And until next time, okay, so Ken Sandy, the best way people can reach you is through your website,
Mhm.
rw360.org. And I will go ahead and share that on the screen. I have not done it so far in this episode. And of course, your book is Peacemaker, The Peacemaker, A Biblical Guide to Resolving Personal Conflict by Ken Sande. And that's available on Amazon. Of course, people can learn more about that and the four topics that you hit on earlier. All right, guys, that's it
Thanks
for
so much.
now. Thank you again so much, Ken.
Thanks so much. Okay.
Thank you,
Bye
Ken.
bye.
Till next
Okay. Bye.